The Michael Morton Project by Mike Iadarola. So the evidence at trial. The day after Christine Morton's body was found, police recovered a bandana covered in blood and other skin and hair particles. It was found at a construction site located in the woods behind the Morton home. Christine's mother had told the police that Michael's son, Eric, was in the house during the murder. Eric was very young at the time, but he had told his grandmother that the murderer was not Michael but a monster. He had specifically said that his, quote, daddy was not home, end quote, when the murder occurred. During the investigation, police questioned many people, including the Morton's neighbors. They were told that a man had consistently parked a van on the street behind the Morton's house and walked off into the nearby wooded area where the bandana was eventually found. Police records also found Christine Morton's missing credit card that had possibly been recovered in San Antonio, Texas, in a jewelry store. According to Morton's defense lawyers, none of this evidence was ever turned over to them at the trial or to the judge. When defense attorneys learned that the prosecution did not plan to call Don Woods, who was the chief investigator of the case, they suspected that the prosecution might actually be hiding and withhold exculpatory evidence. The defense raised this concern with the trial judge, who ordered the prosecution to turn over all reports to Sergeant Woods so that he could conduct a thorough review. However, the evidence concerning Eric's eyewitness account, the van that had been repeatedly parked outside of their house and on the street, and Christine Morton's credit card that was found in Texas were all absent from records given to the judge at trial, meaning that Woods never actually got it, and it was never turned over. With no DNA, the prosecution also presented no witnesses or physical evidence that tied Morton to the crime. The only thing that they had was a hypothesis, and this was that he had beaten Christine to death because she refused to have sex with him on his birthday. After examining the dead body, scientists also stated that she died earlier than when Morton had gone to work, which was at 5:30 in the morning. However, people were taken in at trial, and people thought that the science was flawed and not very reliable when determining the time of death, which ultimately is the case. On February 17, 1987, Michael Morton was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Outcomes. On February 17, 1987, like I said before, Michael Morton was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Morton was offered parole at some point during his sentence, as long as he showed remorse for murdering his wife. However, he refused to do this because he knew that he didn't commit the crime, and he stood true to himself and tried to prove that he was innocent. On October 4, 2011, after spending nearly 25 years in prison, Michael Morton was finally released. He was officially exonerated, however, on December 19th, 2011. Following his release, Mark Allen Norwood, who lived in Austin in the mid-1980s, was charged, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison on March 27, 2013, for the 1986 murder of Michael Morton's wife, Christine Morton. In September 2016, he was once again convicted in a separate case for the January 1988 murder of Deborah Baker in her Austin home. Both of these murders presented women beaten to death at their home under very similar circumstances. Justice was served. However, the death of Deborah Baker could have been avoided if Michael Morton didn't spend time in prison and they weren't out looking for the real murderer. The criminal justice process. Following Morton's formal acquittal, his attorneys asked for a court of inquiry into the actions of prosecutor Ken Anderson, who was then a district judge at the time. A court of inquiry is a special court that investigates allegations of misconduct by officials in Texas. Morton had accused Anderson of failing to provide defense lawyers with exculpatory evidence indicating that another man might have killed his wife, including information that his 3-year-old son witnessed the murder and said that his father was not even at the home at the time, which is what Morton said. Anderson seemed to have a grudge and withheld the evidence from Morton's attorneys. Morton's attorneys discovered this evidence while preparing his final appeal and were able to get Anderson and others involved in the investigation deposed under oath. After the plea agreement was announced, it was publicly revealed that Williamson County District Attorney Jana Duty agreed to authorize an independent review of every case that Anderson had ever prosecuted. The criminal justice system ultimately failed and put an innocent man in prison for almost 25 years. Because of this, like I said before, a murderer was still free and continued to murder. Mark Allen Norwood was convicted of murdering another woman following Christine Morton. I believe that those who withheld evidence from Morton's defense and at trial that proved him innocent should be held responsible. I believe Ken Anderson had to pay a fine, spend 10 days in a county jail, and stop his practice. I do not think that was enough. Those responsible should serve legitimate prison time for what they did, because ultimately they stole a life away from Morton. If I was on the prosecution, I would want every piece of evidence for and against the defendant. However, it seemed as though Michael Morton was targeted because they did not want their hypothesis to be proven wrong. They wanted to put a face to the murderer, and they stuck with Morton and moved on, which is ultimately not fair. I feel as though the defense team did what they could. I think that Morton had a reasonable representation, but the prosecution and attorneys did an awful job and should face harsh penalties for it. They withheld exculpatory evidence, which would have proven Morton to be innocent. After doing some research, there is a Michael Morton Act in place in Texas. The act ensures a more open discovery process, which allows every piece of evidence found to be looked at with a fine-tooth comb. The bill's open file policy removes barriers for accessing evidence for both prosecution and defense. I believe that this is very important because it ensures that everyone gets a fair trial that they deserve. All in all, what happened to Michael Morton was awful and should not happen to anyone. I learned that people should fight for what they believe to be true and follow it, just like Morton did. Morton could have easily given up and said that he committed the murder to put people at ease and give people some closure, but he knew he didn't, and he proved the criminal justice system wrong. And then these are my references.